Hey everyone! Welcome back to another weapon review video. This time, we'll cover the new gear coming in 5.4, which includes a new 5-star catalyst and a new 4-star event polearm. We'll be covering what these weapons do and who else can best use them. As always, disclaimers, timestamps, social media links, and music credits are all down below. Without further ado, let's get started. The first weapon is Mizuki's signature 5-star catalyst, Sunny Morning Sleepin'. It has a 542 base attack and a 265 EM substat. Stay with me for this one because the passive is super complicated. When you trigger Swirl, EM is increased by 120 for 6 seconds. When you hit enemies with a skill, EM is increased by 96 for 10 seconds. And when you hit enemies with a burst, EM is increased by 32 for 30 seconds. I know, lots of different bonuses in this one. I probably lost a lot of you there, so let's just break it down. If the user is an Animo unit, they can gain a total of 513 EM. Non-Animo units cannot proc the Swirl effect under normal circumstances, so they get only 393 EM. And then there are certain characters who don't deal skill or burst damage with their abilities. Wriothesley and Mualani don't deal skill damage as their damage typings are both under basic attacks, so they'll only get a max of 297 EM. Nahita's burst doesn't deal damage, so she only gets 361. You also have to take into account that this weapon doesn't state it can proc off-field, so we have to assume you can only do it while being on-field. This makes it a lot harder for certain characters to trigger the effect. Off-field Animo units will not be able to maintain the 6-second swirl proc, so that only leaves a guaranteed 32 EM for the burst's 30-second duration. In terms of users, the best unit for this weapon is going to be Mizuki. As an on-field swirl buffer and Animo applicator, she can make use of all of these passives super easily. The EM will improve her skill damage, swirl buffing, and healing. This weapon will also become one of Sucrose's best choices. Being an EM scaling unit, she's going to make great use of the passives for her A4's EM sharing as well as her personal swirling. Because the buffs can only trigger on-field, it will be much more reliable when using her as a driver, which is one of her main roles anyway. It's definitely a massive step up from Sacrificial Fragments, and the only downside is the higher ER cost you'll be trading out in the process. Finally, Lanyan's A4 grants EM scaling, which allows her to utilize the buffs. Similarly to Sucrose, she can maintain the bonus better as an on-fielder, and since her off-field support is mainly focused on the attack scaling shield, I'd only recommend this weapon if you're using her as an on-fielder. There's a couple non-EM scaling Animo units who can still proc the passive, albeit with a less recommended rating. Hazel works as a hybrid between DPS and Swirl Driver. If you're someone who likes to build him for EM instead of damage, this weapon will be one of his best choices. Wanderer, however, focuses primarily on damage over EM, so while he can use the weapon, it's not a recommended choice. Finally, Shan Yun can also use this weapon, but her kit focuses on attack scaling off-field buffing for her plunge teams, not as a main DPS. Next category on the list is non-Animo units with EM scaling abilities. Citlali can make use of this for her shielding and damage, but the skill damage proc will be hard to maintain since that part of her kit comes from off-field. It's also very likely her shield will snapshot the scaling from before she can get the skill EM buff, meaning she'll lose out on that 96 bonus. Yai will be able to get the buffs, and her skill lasts for 14 seconds with the inability to snapshot. So even in an off-field role, her skill EM buff will last for the majority of her duration. And finally, Nahita's not able to get the burst EM bonus. If you use her as an off-fielder, she'll need to swap in occasionally to maintain the skill EM bonus. While she's not as synergistic with the weapon, she's still a viable user. For every other Catalyst user, they can still use the weapon to buff various reactions like Vaporize, Melt, Quicken, etc. But since their kits aren't hard focused on EM, it's not a recommended choice unless you have no other options. You should instead focus on their usual scalings, since they'll have more value in that regard. Overall, this weapon is extremely versatile, and practically every single Catalyst user can utilize its passive. It's going to be much more recommended on EM scaling units, due to the passive buffing that stat in particular. Also, since Mizuki is a standard banner unit, she's not going to have any banner reruns. By proxy, her signature likely isn't going to appear until a Chronicled Wish comes around. An opportunity to get this weapon might not come around for a very long time, but before FOMO hits you with that temptation to pull, first, take a look at your roster and see who can actually use this weapon. From there, figure out whether you actually need this weapon right here, right now. Fortunately, this next weapon is going to be a free event polearm. Still time limited, but without the risk of Primogems being wasted. It's going to be called Gotta say this a little bit slowly. Tama Yurate no Ohanashi. It'll have a 565 base attack and a 30.6% EM substat. When the user uses a skill, they gain a 20 to 40% attack bonus and a 10% movement speed bonus for 10 seconds. It's a super simple weapon, but a nice option overall. The 40% attack is basically going to make up for an attack artifact main stat, allowing you to invest in EM or ER as needed. The ER subset isn't as necessary on as many units, but most of them still use their burst a lot, so that extra value makes it a lot easier to reduce energy needs. For the best users, I split them up in 3 categories. First up is an on-field attack unit. These are characters who make the best use of the weapon's attack and movement speed bonuses. The overall best character is Raiden. She scales primarily on attack, but ER does work to further boost her damage. And she has a window with an on-field burst, so the movement speed can help her close the gap on enemies much easier. Xiao is a unit who primarily relies on battery units to make up his energy, but the subset will make it easier to burst in teams with less particle generation. According to the wiki, movement speed improves jump speed as well, so in a tiny way Xiao gets buffed by this. Although, I don't think it speeds up plunge descent, so I don't think you're actually going to see major improvement from that. Arlecchino's a good option as well, but when you're in a rotation where you start with her skill before doing the rest of your team rotation, you're going to lose a massive chunk of uptime when you return to on-fielding her. So I wouldn't recommend this unless your rotation with her is skill into immediate attack stringing.
Rain outlines your fate. Huh? I'm going in!
Closing in, dancing in the wind.
Rain outlines your fate. Rain cutter, know my sword. Everybody stand back.
Flip and fly. Swift is the swope.
Transfixed.
Next up in the category is the off-field attack units. These characters gain no bonus from the movement speed, but their damage and energy needs get improved. Best on this list is Xiangling, because it is our sacred code that every new polearm has to synergize with her. In addition to the relevant buffs, she can also snapshot the attack, allowing her burst to have the full bonus for its full duration. The exact same mechanics are relevant to Rosaria, who also snapshots her burst. On the topic of cryo polearms, Shenhe can use the 2 stat buffs to improve her capabilities. The attack scaling buff on her skill should be able to snapshot the buff, allowing your teammates to have a slightly higher cryo damage bonus. Finally, while Emily might seem like a good unit, there's a caveat with her playstyle. In optimal rotations, you start with her skill and then refresh her duration through the burst. This would mean she can't gain the attack buff past the first rotation, and while you can skill to refresh the buff, it resets her lamp to level 1, resulting in a damage loss. Also, unlike the other 3 units, Emily doesn't snapshot, so her lamp isn't able to maintain the bonus for longer than 10 seconds. Usually, I'd still say this weapon can be viable, but I really don't think you should use it on her unless you have absolutely no other options. For the final category, we have units with sub-attack scaling. This means characters who specialize in a different stat, but can use the attack stat on a lesser recommended basis. Hu Tao has attack scaling, but she gets a large portion of that stat in her HP conversion, so you're not gaining as much value there. The ER is still useful for bursting on rotation, but at that point, Rightful Reward probably gives you more value because of its HP substat and energy regeneration. Zhongli falls under the same category, since his shield is HP focused, but his damage focuses more on attack. It's a fine option for a DPS build, but nowhere near as useful for shield support. Finally, Cyno's a lot more energy reliant, so the ER is viable on him in situations where energy regen is low. His damage leans towards EM scaling, but the attack and movement speed buffs are still viable here. As for every other polearm user, many of them are hard stuck in alternate scalings, making attack obsolete. They can use the ER substat, but most of those alternate scalers are HP based, which once again, brings back Rightful Reward as a better option for those units. Alright, that's gonna do it for this video. I actually like these new weapons we're adding to the game. Unlike other weapons that are designed in a way for a couple units to be the only usable characters, these two are designed in a way where it's usable on a lot of characters, while still maintaining its specialty on a couple units. The Catalyst is going to be unavailable to pull for a while, so be mindful of that if you're deciding on pulling for it. Meanwhile, the polearm being a free prize means you can obtain it now, and have it saved up for a possible unit later on. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like and subscribe to support the channel. Let me know in the comments whether you're pulling for the Catalyst and who you plan to use either weapon on. Thanks again for watching everyone, and I will see you all next time. Bye!